everybody. Welcome back to On the Fringe. This is Dave. I'm here with Gavin, and we've got a special guest, one of my old friends, Joseph. Joseph has worked extensively as a researcher, and he has done extensive research about Latin America. We're going to be talking today about one of the most important and under the radar countries in Latin America, Bolivia.
That's right. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks, guys, for inviting me. So, like Dave said, I worked for about 3 years as a journalist in the region, as well as a consultant, focusing mostly on three countries. So, Bolivia is one of them, but I also work quite a bit on Colombia and Brazil, and I've spent a lot of time in all three countries reporting, mostly on issues like geopolitics and security issues and democracy. I'm excited to talk to you guys about this stuff.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Sure thing.
Joseph, just to get into this, part of the reason why you're here today is Bolivia has an election coming up, doesn't it?
Well, that we know of. No, I'm just kidding. If it's not canceled, yes, definitely. So the election is next month in early August.
And it's quite a consequential one, if I understand things correctly. Why is this going to be a consequential or at least a very important election for Bolivia?
Yeah, so it marks the 20th anniversary of the election of Evo Morales, who's a very influential president for almost 15 years. Right before the 2019 coup and election, very controversial event, and from 2005 until then. And over 20 years, most of the last 20 years, it's been ruled by the movement towards socialism, the Mass Party. And it's consequential because it could be a reversal. So right now in the polls, we see that the leading candidate is a centrist, which is a something you haven't seen basically since the turn of the century in Bolivia. And it's going to be a very fractured election, which once again we haven't seen in more than 2 decades, where the mass isn't the clear favorite in this. And there's a lot of leftist candidates who are sort of splitting the vote. And Evo Morales, who I mentioned, is also possibly heading to prison, might run. We don't know. He was barred from running, but we don't quite know what's going to happen. And it's consequential too because it'll decide the sort of near or maybe even distant future for Bolivia in terms of the economy and lithium and energy, and it's been going through its worst crisis on basically all fronts, whether it's economic, financial, energy, constitutional, for a very, very long time, basically since the dictatorship. And I think this is a turning point to see if the country decides to stick with the formula, with some of the problems that we'll get into, or maybe try to switch course, maybe regret it, maybe don't, or even go a very right-wing direction, which is possible, although unlikely at this point, and just does a major 180 reversal. We'll see.
Definitely. And I mean, Bolivia does fly under the radar. I really haven't heard that much about Bolivia or its election in the news cycle. Probably not since Snowden and Evo Morales, and this was, geez, 10 years ago. And I
Mhm.
mean, Bolivia, for some of you guys who are listening, Bolivia is the poorest country in South America. The GDP is under $10,000 per capita. And I'm sure you know more about this than I do, Joseph, that in Bolivia, it's pretty divided in terms of wealth, where there are some people that have quite a bit of wealth. There are some people I would imagine in rural areas that are still very, very poor. And the government in the last 15 to 20 years has nationalized some of their mines, and I would imagine that this election is going to be consequential for things like that as well, where the government may be trying to make more deals or maybe trying to appeal to some of these different groups within the country.
No, that's right. And you're right that it's not a country you speak often about. It's 12 million people. I mean, if you compare that to neighboring Brazil with over 200 million people, there's a lot of countries in Latin America that are much bigger and more important than it. But it's often talked about because of its energy resources, as you talked about, which is going to be a big source of contention this election. It's already been talked about quite a bit. There's a debate this week, and honestly, the economy and energy were the biggest topics by far. And we see these as sort of leading issues in the election. And like you said, we don't quite know what a new government might do, whether it's continue the deals with China and Russia, maybe expand them to include the US, maybe abandon them and nationalize. We don't quite know. And the candidates are proposing a lot of different avenues, and I think that's where voters are trying to figure it out.
So to just go back to, you were talking about the MAS, the movement towards socialism, which has been the dominant political party for the last 20 years. A big source of MAS support was the indigenous population and the unionized indigenous workers that predominated in the coca industry and in the mining industry as well. So, how is this going to play out? Are those voters sort of scattered between candidates? Is that voting base collapsing? Are we
Mm.
seeing a collapse of that voting base in real time? Or do you think they're just not as consequential as they used to be? Are they not able to sway the election in the way they once were?
So it's a very small but very powerful voting bloc. I wouldn't say that they make up the majority of the population or even the majority of the indigenous vote, which is about 60 to 65% of the population, if you count all three major ethnic groups. But I would say that it is still a very relevant political bloc, especially for the left, the mass in particular. I would say a lot of their sort of energetic support, people who do the organizing, maybe even some crowdfunding, organizing for candidates, where they pull their candidates from is often those areas, whether it's in La Paz, whether it's in El Alto, whether it's Cochabamba, all
Hmm.
big, bases of support for indigenous groups. But I would say that to the center and the right, maybe it doesn't matter as much as it used to. What matters more broadly is whether they can capture the sort of imagination of the Bolivian voter into thinking that they can fix these problems. It's an election where I think indigenous issues are sort of taking a sort of a second, a backseat, if you will, where the economy and just the general crisis state that Bolivia's under is really driving the narrative. And a lot of candidates are focusing on that, whereas in the past few elections, indigenous issues were a lot more prominent. And you had a lot more sort of micro, even cultural issues come up. This election is definitely unlike those, where I think what will decide who ends up winning, whether it's by a small or big margin, is whether they can make the average Bolivian think that they have their interests at heart. And that's most important for workers and middle class folks, as well as low income people that make up a great majority. It's a very unequal country, but the great majority of Bolivians are living in a a sort of a pretty dramatic state at the moment.
Can you just describe for us briefly what that, because we've talked about the economic crisis, we've talked about the sort of general state of crisis in Bolivia. Can
Mhm.
you just tell us what that looks like day to day? If I'm a Bolivian, how does that
Yeah.
affect me?
So first of all, the average salary, the average person lives in rural areas, and the average salary in the rural areas is about $2 or $3 a day, very small. A lot of that base is still agricultural or living with very informal kind of sectors. So the informal economy is about 60%, and wages in the informal economy are very low. Most people don't live in big cities, they live around them. And I would say that this particular era has marked the average person's day-to-day life through a few things. So you had, first of all, the dollar shortage crisis. So the government basically printed way too much money and made too many deals using dollars and didn't think of having more reserve currency. And so now it's running out of dollars at a time when relations with the US are at, I would say, an all-time low or maybe near all-time low. And the current government's posture is we don't want any more dollars, and they're looking to join the BRICS. They're looking to get currency swap deals with China and Russia and maybe even others. but nobody really in Bolivia is believing that the ruble or the yuan or even the real are good currencies to use for their savings or their retirement. And so they still want dollars. And as a result of this shortage, you've had the dollar exchange rate collapse with almost more than quintupled in the last 6 months. Very terrible. And so a lot of people are really struggling over that. There's also the energy crisis where there's a lack of petroleum and natural gas, even though Bolivia is a natural gas rich country, it exports most of it to neighboring countries. And it's had to import a lot of it from Russia through boats through Peru. And you have very long lines at gas stations. Gas is very expensive at the moment. You also have an economic crisis, so unemployment and inflation are very high at the moment, even though the government is producing these studies to say that no, actually things are great and you guys are just sore losers. But the day-to-day reality is things are quite bad. There's also a constitutional crisis, so Morales and Arce, the current president, who's not running for re-election because he's very unpopular. They've been unpopular mostly because of their sort of authoritarian turn and reforming judicial institutions and election boards. So there's a big constitutional crisis that I would say has started in 2019, but is still continuing today. And so you have all these things converging into one giant crisis, and I think that's really the core of what's at stake here.
Yeah. Well, you were just saying that Arce is not running. So who are some of the main players that are going to be coming in and potentially trying to solve some of Bolivia's problems? It
So
sounds
what's
like they'll
good?
have a lot on their plate.
That's right. And what's good about Bolivia, one of the good things about Bolivia is that if you know the players for like 20 years, you will know them now. It's basically the same old people that we've known for a long time, with a couple surprises. So I'll start with the big question mark. So Evo Morales was barred from running, is an accused and I would say confirmed pedophile and a narco guy who's sort of hiding in the jungle and the chapare, doing his thing. But it's still unclear whether he'll run because he still has a very strong base of support among the left. I would say if on a good day up to 20% of the voting base could mobilize and really sway the election in a way. I don't think he could win it, but I think he could definitely tank the left's chances at forming government. That's the big question mark if he'll run or not. And then Luis Arce endorsed two candidates. So there's Andronico, who's the leader of the government in the Senate for the MAS. He's a very
Mhm.
young guy, very politically savvy guy, but kind of unknown to the public until recently. He hasn't officially declared to run and wasn't in the debate this week, so it's unsure whether he'll run or not. But he could possibly get a pretty big chunk of the vote regardless. And then the big mass candidate is this guy Del Castillo, who's a lawyer, 35 something years old, very young. He was the Minister of Government, which is in charge of the police and a lot of other things for the last 4 years. And he's sort of the favorite among the mass. Polling right now puts him at 15%, but he's only campaigned for a couple weeks. So that might go up. The leader right now for who has the most voting intentions, polling is hard to come by, at least reputable polling. But the only ones that I could see from the big two newspapers have this guy, Samuel Doria Medina, who's this youngish business guy. He ran before, runs the largest cement manufacturer in Bolivia, so has a lot of political and economic capital to run his campaign, and he's running as a moderate third wave voice, trying to cut through a lot of the sort of more radical parties. I would say it's worked in a way so far, mostly because the other parties and other candidates are so fractured and unpopular. So he's winning with only 20% of the vote. And then there's the right-wing candidates. So you have a few of them, but they're all basically the same. They're all sort of they have military backgrounds. One was a former president, one is a mayor, and they have a lot of sway in more of the business community, more in Santa Cruz, the more conservative, more religious center. But they are only polling about 10%. And what you might notice is that if I add all these up, it doesn't add up to 100%. That's because a lot of people are undecided. Last poll I checked was between 20 to 40% of the electorate still don't know who they're voting for. And
Wow.
to be honest, that I would say that's even a small number. When I talk to people, whether it's in La Paz or Cochabamba or Santa Cruz or wherever, they all say to me that they don't like anybody and they don't know who they're voting for. They might end up settling for the lesser of two evils or lesser of six or seven evils in this case. But it's gonna be difficult to know, although right now the centrist candidate is winning by not a lot.
Guess they're going to be having vanilla ice cream for the next 5 years
That's
or
right.
10 years.
That's right.
Oh,
Man.
wow. So that's the sort of domestic political situation. You talked about geopolitically. There's sort of in an odd position. Certainly during the Cold War era, there was a succession of pretty pro-US, mostly military regimes.
Hmm.
And that sort of went away in the early 2000s. Historically, Moss has been fairly, I wouldn't say, well, now they're pretty openly anti-American, and they've become more so, I think, as time has gone on.
Hmm.
They've allied themselves pretty openly, or at least tried to ally themselves with Russia and China. Do you see that continuing, or do you see that maybe dialing back somewhat, even if Castillo somehow won the election? Do you think that would sort of be dialed back? Does that seem more like a maybe relic of the Morales era?
Mm. I would say there's a big anti-imperialist contingency, particularly on the left. Whether that's
Hmm.
representative of the entire Bolivian electorate is hard to know. It hasn't been a top issue this election, so I think it gives a lot more leeway to
Hmm.
whoever wins to maybe change direction a bit. Although I would urge some restraint on the entire American front because it's hard because the rhetoric coming from Evo and Luis Arce and the mass people is very anti-American and very strong. But if you look at the policy, they've kind of behind closed doors quietly been continuing the US relationship. So the US among the big three is still the big commercial and financial partner of Bolivia. It's not China or Russia, at least not yet. And the US has played some part in the lithium process. So there was some small deals given to Energy X, which is this lithium technology company based in Texas. But I would say it's still in the background. Whether it would sort of make a resurgence and come back to the forefront like it did during the Janine Áñez years, 2019, 2020, we don't quite know. And I guess that'll depend on who wins. If it's a more centrist or even a right-wing candidate, I would say it's more likely that the US relationship is a bit more amended. If it's the mass, I think they'll realize very quickly that the yuan and the ruble aren't, first of all, they're not readily available. And secondly, I don't think the average Bolivian even knows what they are, but also wants rubles for their retirement savings. I just don't know if they can make that appeal to people. So I think they'll have to go back to the US and ask for more dollars. Uh, Sometime soon, if they want to have some kind of reserve currency and not default on all their debt payments, that would be nice. And I think that's
You
gonna maybe,
also,
oh, go ahead.
yeah, you also mentioned earlier that a lot of people in Bolivia now facing a paucity of dollars, not wanting to go to rubles or yuan, are choosing to invest in crypto. And I just sort of wondered if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
That's right. So year to year, cryptocurrency transactions are up 500% since last year, which they were already up then, as a sort of reflection of the post-COVID or even since COVID economic and financial crisis that's faced Bolivia, where people, because the dollar exchange rate is so high and so terrible, and because it's not really common for Bolivians to invest in the stock market or buy gold or any of that, crypto has been a big avenue for people to invest and put their savings. And I would also say it's because crypto is completely unregulated, not surprisingly in Bolivia, although the government has promised to regulate it, a lot of people are seeing it as an alternative, and I think it's really illustrative of the state of affairs where crypto is seen as more stable than the alternatives, which I don't know that much about crypto, but what I do know is that it's quite unstable, especially if you're talking about the non-Bitcoin sort of alternative currencies that a
Yeah.
lot of Bolivians are looking
Mhm.
to. So I would caution on that, but it's interesting to see that that's the avenue people are taking.
Definitely. I was going to just go back real quick to what you were saying between the relationship between Bolivia and the US, and then you've got Russia and China in there. I know that the US is worried about future lithium access. And even though Bolivia has nationalized a lot of their lithium deposits, the US still sees this, and Southcom in particular, US Southern Command, sees that this is critical to US national security, and having Russia and China and even Iran in there is just absolutely disastrous to US position, not only in Latin America, but in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, that's right. I would mostly blame the US for this. I know it's kind of unpopular to do so, but I honestly think they've dropped the ball. So they've reduced significantly their diplomatic presence and any kind of business presence in Bolivia. They haven't really put the resources to push back on this and to even try to make the case that the US is the right choice. I also think they fumbled very hard two things. So the 2019 coup with the election, I think Bolivians are still very sour, rightly so, I would say, about the fact that there was U.S. involvement and that the OAS through the U.S. was involved. Just a second.
Man. But to
Sorry.
say, I don't want to completely skip over the whole crypto conversation as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is critical, and this is something a lot of people are not thinking about, is you have countries like Bolivia that have a lack of internal financial institutions. And yeah, you could have people there saying this is a better investment for me longer term.
Hmm.
And you could even have the whole entire, this is Dave putting on his tinfoil hat, that the whole entire global south goes, we're going to put our retirement funds into these cryptocurrencies that are extremely cheap for us. But if we, as a whole entire body of people, 3 billion, 4 billion people are investing in this, we'll be able to have enough to actually provide for our retirement, which would be absolutely crazy. But in some ways, it could be actually feasible.
It could be, but I would say it depends on what kinds of cryptocurrencies they're investing in. If they're buying like Dogecoin kind of stuff, like meme coins, I
Yeah.
would very much caution against that. But what I've seen is a lot of people are looking at the US dollar crypto equivalent, which I would say that that's not that bad. Whether it'll be more regulated and fall off a cliff is to be seen, but so far it's one of the more predictable alternatives. I would say though, on the point about the UAS and all this, so what the US did that I think is really unfortunate is they haven't really tried to correct the record or apologize for their role in
Hmm.
2019, and I think a lot of Bolivians still uh, hold a grudge against that on that front. Elon Musk, who's now, we don't quite know what his role is anymore, but was at one point a very vocal part of the Trump administration, once said about Bolivia that they'll coup whoever they want and nobody cares. And it's still something that's quoted very often by Bolivians. And then you also had in the lithium bidding process, so Energy X was making one of the more sort of popular bids at the time, and the CEO during the bidding process came out and wrote a New York Times op-ed criticizing the Bolivian people and the Bolivian government and saying that they need to get over their colonialism bias and that this is it's time for development, stop crying. And I think it's just completely tone deaf and very unfortunate mistake or ignorance rather. And
Yeah.
it's some of those things that really hurt US reputation in the country. That and the fact that they killed the Che
Yeah.
during the Cold War in Bolivia. I think there's these events that the US never tried to rectify for, never tried to separate itself from its reputation and apologize. And I honestly think they could do better. Not to say that China and Russia are good options. I don't think they are. But when you look at a lot of these mistakes, it makes you sort of understand the Bolivian position.
And I mean, this has been a historical pattern really for us since about, I would say, the 40s on in our relationship with Bolivia, where we kind of have supported a lot of, frankly, extremely bad things. And generally, I feel like, to sort of go off of what Musk said, it
Hmm.
maybe not so much that people don't care. I don't think most people in America know. I mean, if you want to talk about like the cocaine coup in 80, most people in America would just go, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never heard about this. If you talk about 2019, I would actually, just before we go, I would actually like you to just walk us through what happened in 2019, because I feel like that whole sort of craziness got skipped over for a lot of people. I mean, it was right before COVID. I think it bled into COVID, and most people missed what actually happened in 2019 and who's Ginny Nanez.
Sure. So the very short version of it is that you had an election up till which Evo Morales, the mass president, was becoming increasingly unpopular, had failed a referendum which he had claimed he won, about extending presidential terms, and was becoming increasingly authoritarian and was abandoning a lot of his social democratic policies that I think helped alleviate a lot of the core fundamental problems in Bolivia, especially economic and social inequalities. And then you had an election where Morales was running as a very unpopular incumbent. And there were early on a lot of calls about irregularities in the election. A lot of them were sort of propped up by the right-wing media even before the election started. And I say right-wing media not in a sense that it's like, you know, partially correct sometimes, or even fully correct sometimes, like Fox News in the US, where like sure they do a lot of really terrible reporting, but they also have sometimes some things right. No, I'm talking about completely made up Facebook posting kind of news. And they, I guess, convinced a lot of the opposition to really drum up that support. And then early on during the election, votes weren't even being counted at that point. You had the OAS, the Organization of American States, which is a multilateral organization of all governments, most governments in the Americas, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And, it's a very sort of organization that's very much run by the United States. They're the biggest financier, and they usually choose the president or the Secretary General, rather, and most of the programming. And they were already talking about election fraud and votes being miscounted or Evo Morales rigging the election. And they were doing that the entire time of the election, and at some point called for the votes to be for the vote counting to stop because of these irregularities. And the opposition picked up on this and started organizing, and there were a lot of efforts, mostly in Santa Cruz. There were protests and all of this and it eventually led to Janine Áñez, who was a kind of mostly unknown legislative leader. I believe she was the president of the Senate at the time.
Yeah.
And she declared herself the president, de facto president, because Evo Morales, who at the time was leading in the votes, had illegitimately won the election, and that she was going to return democracy to Bolivia. And she did this whole parade with a giant Bible near the government house. And
Always a good sign.
yeah, always a good sign. And one of her first acts was that she deployed the military and the police against any mass protesters who were calling for the election to be called back or resumed, or for Evo Morales to be put as the president because he had, by the time the votes were counted, he had won the election. And there were a lot of people killed, a lot of people disappeared, a lot of people brutalized. and she governed for about a year, and was a big reversal in the mass in the sense that she cut all of the social programs. Most of her cabinet were white, were not indigenous, cut a lot of rights for indigenous and rural communities. Was a big U.S. ally for that period, and this was during the first Trump administration. And Mike Pompeo, who I believe was his Secretary of State at the time, was very much in favor of that government. Same as John Bolton. A lot of really difficult times for Bolivians, and they associate that with the Americans, and they believe that they were involved in the coup and then supporting the subsequent government. And Agnes right now is rotting in prison because of what she did. She was sentenced because of, I believe, terrorism and it was a crime against humanity, something to
I
that
think so.
effect,
Yeah.
because she financed extrajudicial death squads to go after supporters of the mess and the left and union leaders and all this. Basically, like a Cold War era kind of dictatorship, just
Mhm.
without the man in the military uniform, basically. Um, and I think that really informs a lot of what the left is fighting against or fighting for in
Mhm.
this election up to today, and will do for the near future, most likely, because that year was so bad and it was associated with the Americans, and the Americans haven't really done much to disassociate themselves from it. And I think it's really crucial. I'm glad you asked that question. I think it's very crucial to talk about it.
Yeah, that is huge. I didn't know any of that.
See, there
Yeah,
you
I mean,
go.
yeah, it wasn't really covered. It wasn't really covered, and I think when it was covered in the American press, it was very much, I mean, I hate to say this, but the tone was very much these wacky people in South America are at it again.
Right.
That
Just
was kind of
general chaos, nothing
the
about the
general,
cause. Yeah.
nothing about the cause and nothing about, I mean, you were correct. Pompeo and Bolton went out very publicly when it happened and were like, this is what we need more of. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm sure this is the thing. In America, it probably didn't make it to the front page. In Bolivia, people lost family members.
That's right.
Um, and they're going to remember that for the rest of their lives.
And just to put that into a even worse image, like after the protests were quelled, you basically in the major cities, you had the downtown core was controlled by the military, where like they basically chose who came in and who came out. And if you were deemed to be an undesirable person at that time, they would abuse you, they would intimidate you, they would even there were cases of women being assaulted and all this. It was just a terrible image for a lot of people, and I don't think it's vanished, to be honest.
That brings me to the next question, which is, I think, an important one in terms of what you just said. So, how do you get from that regime that you just painted so vividly?
Hmm.
How do you get from that to where we are today, where it sounds like we're having competitive elections, Moss is back in some form, maybe not as competitive, but there's still a player. Is this some sort of testament to kind of the robustness of Bolivian democracy, where they were able to sort of shrug that off and go, no, we're still a democratic country. We're still committed to this.
I would say so, and there's obvious problems with the way Mass has done elections in terms of changing the electoral council, and the judicial elections are kind of a joke. They're kind of run by the Mass for the Mass to get legitimacy and appoint
Oh,
their own
it's this.
judges.
Are they having judicial elections like Mexico?
Yes, so they already had it 2 months ago, I believe. And
Okay.
they're like mass partisans becoming judges is the kind of, and a lot of them have legal training, but they I don't know if they should be judges, some of them. It's
I
just
just it's not very American of me, but I just have a real knee-jerk reaction against that being an elected position. Like
I agree with you. I agree with
it,
you.
Yeah.
the core of my soul, I feel like it's a bad idea. Um,
I'm all for more democracy and more direct democracy, and I think this is a case of direct democracy, but it doesn't mean that every position should be one. Like, I don't think we should elect our bureaucrats, for example.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think a 25-year-old school graduate sh wanting to be junior analyst for the Department of Transportation, I don't think he should run for election to get that. Like, some positions you're supposed to just be an impartial, neutral analyst of the facts and trying to look at the law and the way things are and trying to rule on it impartially. I think judges is one of those. And you really don't want to mash government sort of politics and partisanship with the law. But regardless, so there's these issues, right? But I think even beyond those, Bolivia is not Venezuela. Bolivia is not Nicaragua or Cuba.
Mhm.
It's not a dictatorship. It is a flawed, but it is a democracy. And there are still competitive elections, especially at the national and local levels. And I think the reason why it's so fractured is partly because of how unpopular everybody is at this point. The right is unpopular because of 2019 up to 2021 mostly, and the dictatorship period. And I would say the left is unpopular because of Evo, the way he ran things in the last few years. Arce has also been pretty bad on protests and listening to big contingencies of his voters, bad at managing the economic and energy crisis. So you have legitimate reasons for both sides being bad, and I think the center isn't speaking to how extremely bad things are for the country. And so even though they're the most popular option at this point, they don't have actually a lot of core support like the mass and the right have.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph, for that analysis. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in August and whether this goes ahead and what result comes out of it. I mean, do you see any path forward where there is maybe not necessarily the centrists, but some way of sort of breaking this gridlock
Hmm.
that this country seems to be just mired in? A country that, as you mentioned, is so rich in natural resources, whether we're talking about lithium or natural gas or even other rare earth minerals, but just cannot get over the sort of chronic dysfunction that seems at this point to be baked in.
That's right. So I think this is an old case of the resource curse,
Mm.
where in a way their natural resources are really plaguing their ability to unite around a common vision and actually progress together. And it doesn't help that they don't have the technology to exploit it themselves at this point, and so are having to rely on these superpowers to get most of the money and the benefit from it. It's not a sustainable long-term economic model, but
Mm.
I'm hopeful that things will keep improving. They've improved quite a bit in the last few decades. If you looked at the way things were during the Cold War versus now, it's completely unrecognizable country, especially in the cities. It's really remarkable what they've been able to accomplish since that period, and I'm hopeful that it would continue. Whether that is under a sort of a centrist government or a left-wing government, I'm not quite sure. But I think things will keep progressing in a certain direction. I hope so. Maybe it's just the optimist in me. But Bolivia's already gone through a lot of crises and survived. I think it will do so again.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on. And thank you guys for listening to this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.